public relations in India is still seen largely through the prism of media relations. It's not seen as a function or a discipline that drives long-term brand building.
Communication professionals need to understand what the role is. It's strategy, it's risk management, management of stakeholders internally and externally, management of personnel, your teams and your agencies, and having core communication skills.
Crisis mitigation, which is something that happens every day, is as valuable as crisis management after a crisis has emerged.
You need to really love and understand research. One should be able to make sense of research and create insights and positions. And third is you have to have an appetite for governance.
The future of media relations is probably only as bright as the future of the media.
You embrace the trends, you understand the business, and repeat.
Hello everybody. Today I plan to do some soul searching. Does PR comms really and truly matter to a business, to an organization? Are we, the PR comms professionals, able to showcase the impact of reputation management on business? Are we able to speak truth to power? Is our value perceived as, say, event managers and news disseminators, or are we perceived as strategic enablers of business? If you are keen to elevate the function and move it upstream in the value chain, then today's discussion should interest you. Joining me are two esteemed professionals from our fraternity. First, we have Arun Sudhaman, who started as a journalist and is now the CEO and editor-in-chief at PRovoke Media, the world's foremost media and events platform for the PR and comms industry, including the Sabre Awards. Frankly, if you are in this industry, he needs no introduction. My second guest is Carson Dalton, who is the Senior Director, Public Affairs, Communications and Sustainability for Coca-Cola's operations across India and Southwest Asia. He was the founding head of the Ola Mobility Institute and Facebook's first head of comms in India. And he also began his career as a freelance writer for various publications. Thanks, Carson, Arun, for joining me today, and hopefully we are going to discuss some, should I say, uncomfortable truth, and you're both going to be very candid about it.
It's a pleasure to join, and I think hopefully a really important conversation that the industry needs to have, and we will try and do our little bit to encourage it.
Certainly, it's exciting to be here. Looking forward to listening and contributing and taking on with this.
So let me start with you, Arun, and the first one, let's just go straight for it. Do you think PR comms professionals are valued by organizations?
In India?
In India.
They're not valued enough, I think, but I'm not sure if it's the people that are not valued or the discipline itself.
Right.
If you look at India, it has all of the ingredients required to be a very successful public relations market. Not just a very successful one, but a very lucrative public relations market. It has, a large base of educated professionals who are both highly creative, resilient, adaptable, used to dealing with challenges. It has an incredible amount of diversity across the country, both in terms of language, socioeconomics, religion. That kind of stuff always encourages more sophisticated public relations work. The work we see from India is as good as anything in the world, if not better. Regularly wins global Sabre Awards, is culturally sensitive, demonstrates social awareness, commercial impact. We all know about the Indian growth story. It's one of the best performing economies in the world over the last 18 months, and certainly amongst big countries. It's even better in terms of its performance. So there's a lot of economic growth here at a macro level. And yet, as well as the PR market has performed here, you can't shake the feeling that it is undervalued. The fees that are paid to agencies, the budgets that are approved for in-house communications department, and even the salaries that professionals earn are not up to global standards.
Why do you think that is so?
Well, that's the big question. And we can discuss, I think there are several factors. I think it's a really complicated equation. I will start off with a couple of factors, and I'm sure Carson has his own observations on why this might be the case. A couple of things I'll say. I think, first of all, public relations in India is still seen largely through the prism of media relations, of reactive publicity work, short-term often. It's not seen as a function or a discipline that drives long-term brand building and long-term value creation. So it's that classic problem that communications has, and it's not unique to India, but I think it's particularly pronounced in India, where the communications function is seen as a cost rather than a creator of value. I think it's viewed too narrowly in terms of media and in terms of its impact on the next day's headlines, as opposed to the full range of stakeholder management. That's the issue. I mean, that's one of the issues, I think, in terms of how the discipline is viewed. I think there are other issues as well, which no doubt we will discuss, but I also think that there are problems in terms of personnel. I mean, I think there's a huge amount of talent, but I think there's a lot of conservatism, particularly on the client side. I don't think senior clients necessarily are agitating for more budget. I think they're quite good at managing upwards and preserving their roles, but not necessarily expanding the scope of what they do. If you look at a lot of the communication departments in India, they're still narrowly defined, whereas in many countries they will include, public affairs and policy comms and sustainability, investor relations, digital and social media, change management, employee engagement. There are so many ways to showcase and build the value of public relations. But I think it's still quite a narrow prism through which the discipline is viewed. That would be, I think, for me at least, I think that's where a lot of this starts.
And Carson, hand over heart on this one, a very candid one. Is it that the PR comms professionals, their success is evaluated more by how they've been able to manage internal stakeholders, or do a lot of what Arun is saying, which is actually expand what they can do and show outcomes?
Firstly, Arun's report card on how the industry has grown and where it's should be set out to be, and even pointing what the North Star should be, is accurate. Does everyone believe in it? Hand over heart, perhaps in closed rooms, they do. I think communication professionals need to understand what the role is. It's strategy, it's risk management, management of stakeholders internally and externally, management of personnel, your teams and your agencies, and having core communication skills. Arun has spoken about media relations, but how many of us are actually going deep into the other skills that are required? Beyond public relations, analyst relations, sustainability, policy communications, content, digital, executive communications, and the menu of services that a communications team can offer a business is limited, and they aren't being pushed, or they don't feel the need to. And I think here is where lies the opportunity for professionals to go beyond stakeholder management.
Right.
And to sort of really carve out, and I wouldn't use the term always while we use it, a seat at the table, but create not a niche, but be bigger and bolder in their ambition and vision of what they can provide to a company, to an organization, how they can build a brand. And I think that is really where the North Star is, and how we can progress towards creating, as Arun said, once again, not only successive, but also lucrative, not only for the agency side, but even for people who work within teams. Being successful and lucrative in their careers and for the function.
Arun, what will get corporates to value PR comms as a strategic role? I mean, is it like Carson is saying that you push internally, you pick up more, expand your scope? Is that the only route, or is there more to it?
I think there's more to it. I think that's really important. And I think it's easy to discount sometimes what Carson has said. It's easy to kind of blame the corporate, the faceless corporate, and say they don't value public relations or communications enough. I think Carson is correct in saying that it's also an individual responsibility for everyone that works in this industry, particularly, I would say, incumbent on leaders and in-house communications leaders, I would say, even more so. This challenge of trying to demonstrate and elevate the value of public relations, again, I would say is not unique to India. I would say in Asia in general, it's an issue. I think it's far more understood in the more mature markets. So if you take the US and UK, so some of this, we have to say, is down to the relative immaturity of the sector in India. If we're talking about modern public relations, how long has it really been alive in India? Maybe 3 or 4 decades, right?
At the most.
Right.
Lesser probably.
Sure. But even then, I would still say it's behind where it should be in terms of value. Now, the conversations I have, so all of my observations are really drawn through conversations I have with people, whether it's agency or in-house. And one of the things that comes up again and again is that corporates don't appear to see the value, the strategic value in communications on a day-to-day basis. And where they do realize the value is often in a crisis management situation. And that's a really hard thing. You can't have a crisis every day. Certainly you don't really want that.
You don't want to, exactly.
But a crisis is great for demonstrating the value of communications. The challenge is to showcase that, crisis mitigation, which is something that happens every day, is as valuable as, crisis management after a crisis has emerged. And I just think it takes time. It takes a lot of proactive work. And I do think it, as Carson put it, it's about thinking bigger and bolder, and not being complacent, not being satisfied with whatever it is, whatever part of the pie that communications has now. We saw during the pandemic, I think we saw how valuable in-house communications departments were to their companies.
Came into being at that time.
Right. And very little of it was about selling products. So much of it was really about the full range of stakeholder management, whether it was executive communications, making CEOs appear more human, or it was, reassuring staff, or it was helping communities, governments. But will that elevation in value persist? I would say we're already seeing, a regression to, perhaps the mean. I'm hearing of functions being shrunk because, economic situation is tougher in many places. I was in Singapore a couple of weeks ago, and it's a little bit disappointing to hear of comms heads being let go, functions being shrunk or even eliminated in some cases at big companies.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is not a challenge unique to India, but like I said earlier, I think it's particularly pronounced here.
So Arun spoke about crisis management, crisis mitigation. Today, on a median level, when comms professionals are not doing this, what are they doing? and they've not expanded the portfolio?
I think it's fashionable for communication professionals to say that we are the greatest crisis managers. And firstly, the communications functions is the conscience keeper for an organization, which means you're not only a wartime general, you have to be a peacetime commander.
Right.
And how much of that muscle are they really growing on being peacetime commanders? I think, and I'm so happy that Arun said that, because my heart is with joy when during COVID, not because of COVID, is because that was really the time everybody looked at the comms guy.
Yeah.
We did everything.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't use, and the word regression also makes sense, because since then we've perhaps clinging onto that laurel. But when I talk about peacetime commanders, how are we talking about how is the function getting bigger and bolder? How are we looking at growing our categories? How are we looking at supporting the business? How are we looking at creating market access? How are we looking at the risks that are going to hit us? We have an ESG metrics today, which most organizations follow. How is the communications function really feeding into that? How are we plugged into each and every function? And are we really the heartbeat of an organization? I think it was GE's Jack Welch who said this, that communications is the heart of our business. But are we really doing that today, or are we back to being a siloed function? And I think it's easy to ask the questions, but on deeper reflection, are we moving beyond? And I don't see that happening. And it's happening in bursts, but organizations and professionals need to challenge each other. Professionals who are holding the roles need to challenge organizations and growing the pie of the function. And organizations need to challenge the function to saying, what more can we do?
Is that the one that is one route? Is there any other way you feel for the scope to grow, the importance to grow?
I think it's incumbent upon professionals and leaders to ensure that they're capable, first of all, to play that role. If you look at the three biggest, let's say, issues affecting business right now, and if you look at research studies, the same issues often emerge. It's geopolitics, it's ESG, and it's technological transformation, particularly highlighted by AI. Now, communications is fundamental to all of them. And yet, in how many companies is the comms department or the corporate affairs department really responsible for, let's not even say driving strategy or policy in those areas, but having a strong voice in all of those areas? Not enough, actually. And one of the problems with communications is everyone thinks they can do it. And there's a lot of competition for, whether it's comms departments or PR agencies. There are, there's people in advertising or marketing or digital who are extremely well versed in many of these areas. There's the C-suite who probably thinks they understand employee engagement and executive communication better than their communication specialists do. Sometimes it seems to me that the discipline of communication, and I mean that in the broadest sense, has become divorced from the actual function. And the function has become relegated and commoditized to a small part. And obviously I'm kind of exaggerating here to make a point. But I think the broader point is there is truth to this, because if you look at the sort of day-to-day work that comms functions do, it's still, I think, too focused on just a small part of the spectrum. And honestly, a less valuable part of the spectrum too. So I think professionals and leaders, first of all, they need to be in a position to say, we have a voice, we have something to say on these issues. This is why we should be doing this. These are the results that will happen. And this is what it will mean for the business. Speaking the language of business is a really critical part of this, because business is never going to speak the language of communicators.
I mean, you spoke about geopolitical risks, and you look at so many other risks that businesses are navigating today, whether it's supply chain or cyber or whatnot. How much are communication people getting involved in advising their own business to navigate it?
Increasingly, they are involved for sure, but I think it's still not as frequent as it should be. And you can see that by all the crises that emerge, and you can only conclude in most of these cases, what you can't even ask what was the comms team thinking.
Yeah.
You can only conclude the comms team wasn't involved.
Yeah. True.
And I agree with Arun that communications and corporate affairs have an active role in advising organizations, managing supply chains, and the boards on geopolitical. We've seen the crisis in Gaza. That's impacted consumer companies. There's a boycott movement. And we've got to understand the impact of business and really ensure it's not about only mitigating, but how do you protect your brand, protect your category, and sail through with your customers.
Yeah.
So that the trust that they have in the brand is retained.
Yeah.
When a couple of, and I think maybe 8 to 10 quarters ago, and it's continuing now, but there's a supply chain crisis. How do organizations respond to it? I mean, there were automobile businesses who couldn't ship cars fast enough.
Yeah.
How do you respond to customers? How are you working with governments to resolve and mitigate it? And so on and so forth. I think today we are in a full-blown climate crisis.
Yeah.
And how are brands responding to it? We're talking today about adaptation. And I think people who subscribe and purchase these brands and look at these businesses are saying, what are you doing for society? How are you really contributing to net zero? How are we saving the planet? And I don't think the conversations about how we're leaving it in a better place, I think it's gone to an extent with, can we keep status quo? And I think all of these questions require thinking. It's not about narrative, it's about action. It's about companies forming and coming together, working with governments, having the right programs. And that's all led by whom? The communications and the corporate affairs department. I think this is where we rise to the occasion.
Yeah.
And again, be seen as the conscience keeper, as someone who can take the bold steps, have the right programs, and move and have bolder ambitions for the function.
Be able to speak truth to power.
And the business of language, and the language of business, as Arun said, because this is the time you tell them, if you don't do X, this is how it impacts, not today, but 3 years from now. And I think that's because we have moved from a VUCA to a Barney world. And today the world is brittle, it's non-comprehensible, and everyone wants to understand that how do you navigate? So who is the navigator of that ship? The chief executive is looking around the table, and it's then when he looks to the comms and the corporate affairs team and says, can you give me the answers? Because this is from the outside. So we are also that function which is the WINSOC, which is listening, bringing in, helping assimilate, and providing the board and the chief executive and helping them make the right decisions to take an organization and the business forward.
But this again will boil down to the basic premise on competency, capability. So what, according to you, then is the right talent playbook so that the value is perceived?
It's evolving, Nandan. And I don't think the report card is as bad as one. I think there are a lot of professionals who are moving up the value chain. I think communication professionals, if I have to look just at the comms person or the PR guy, as we say, I think they're evolving in how do you really understand what's going on outside? How do you synthesize it? How do you create the right narratives? And how are you evolving your skill sets? How are you moving beyond just PR and media to whether it's speaking to a different set of stakeholders, whether it's analysts, whether it's, if you're listed financial, you're speaking to not a Wall Street, but in whichever country that you operate in. Today, speaking to policymakers is so important, and it's not only the tech sector, but every sector has to interface with the government. And for that, you do have specialists like the public policy professionals or your GR. But public policy is really about data. It's about insights, bringing that together and helping form and influence policies that is right for business and society. There is no science. I mean, one can. It is rational thinking. It's having the right data, it's having the right insights, and having set of conversations and dialogues. And while we can build it into different formats, I think that is where communications has that power to help needle all of this together and present the right picture.
Arun, what do you see happening on the global front in context of talent, and what is it Indian comms professionals could do to kind of reach that level?
I mean, I think on a global level, what we see is, increasing specialization in all of the areas Carson mentioned. So across the full range of stakeholders, whether it's public policy, whether it's investors, whether it's communities, consumers, business to business, and then of course in specific areas, whether it's healthcare, technology, and then even more specialization within niches. So there's a huge amount to learn, and there's, I think, increasing demand for that kind of talent. I think the issue is all of this requires investment, and what corporate affairs functions, comms functions, and agencies as well all need to be able to do is make that case. This is why investment is required. These are the skills and the talent that are required. And then what is the return on that investment? What is the return on these kinds of talent? Fundamentally, what is the value creation that you can attribute to reputation, whether that's from a short-term or a long-term lens? Because that's what all of these talent is kind of adding up to. And that really is the big challenge. Because if you look at a marketing department, for example, they have no problem getting investment for, in some cases, hundreds of people across marketing and innovation and research and transformation and media buying and so on. But for communications, if you just getting to double digits is a real accomplishment. And really, it should be the other way around. If you think about it, if you think of the range of influence corporate affairs has now over so many different aspects of a business, but it's being able, I think, to make that case in a language that the budget holders within a corporation understand, and that it's almost like sort of last mile connectivity. That's the real challenge. I think really the industry has sort of evolved successfully everywhere else, but it's just that final challenge, I think, of being able to say this kind of investment X will lead to Y, and obviously you don't always want to be that reductive, but sometimes you need to be.
So suggest what are the various things a comms team should be asking for when they're creating budgets, when they're asking for investment. I mean, one is a PR agency. What are the various other things?
I mean, I think it comes back to Carson's point. It's about having the skills. So first of all, you're looking at all of the different stakeholders you need to engage with. Do you have the expertise and talent to engage with them and build successful, strong, and mutually beneficial relationships with all of those stakeholders? And then what's required to build those relationships? You're talking about going from research to planning to creative to execution to measurement. You need all of that.
So, and all these legs.
You need all those legs, and you need all of them for each type of stakeholder group. That doesn't mean you need a person for every single. We all know how
tools.
We all know how these things work. There are a lot of tools. There's a lot of technology. That's another thing that you need. But I would argue that yes, a modern corporate affairs function, if it's really going to live up to its promise, requires expertise, requires talent, and requires tools across that full spectrum, from both kind of a horizontal and a vertical axis. Now that's, of course, if we're talking about the realms of what's possible rather than what is just what's ideally desirable. Yeah. We all know there's budgets in play, and this is not always, it's not always going to be something that's easily accomplished. But I don't see how you can accomplish that with a 2 or 3 person team, which is what I often see in many organizations.
Yeah. What are the various things that you budget for?
Today, teams need to be a little more broad-based in the kind of assets they're creating. Before that, the communication and corporate affairs team need to be the think tank for an organization. And while they could share that responsibility with strategy, but how are we creating the right narratives? Priority narratives, and I think that was a word that I got from you, Nandini, but how are we creating positions for the company? How are we creating assets to bring those positions, to make them come alive? For example, are we tying up with think tanks or research institutions? How are we engaging with academicians in the top educational institutions? How are we creating really interesting reports and so on and so forth? What we always do is we're publicizing for various functions, but how is the communications function creating their own IP, creating their own assets? And the list is endless. You could create a sustainability index, you could create an ESG index, you could, there is enough of creativity in a room. And for that, as Arun says, it cannot be done by a 2 to 3 member team. You need to bring in great project managers, great thinkers, communication specialists who can get the job done. You create external partnerships. For that, you need money. So you need money for talent, you need money for partnerships, you need to execute. And I think, what is the picture of success? Are we getting there? And for that, so you need a full stack of talent, you need a full stack of partnerships. And that is what, going back to what we said, this is the role of peacetime commanders in an organization. Because every day you don't need a fire. So how are we really bringing to fore the real capabilities of the communication function? And this is not only about thinking about today, this is thinking about tomorrow and building that bigger, bolder ambition for the comms function. Few organizations do it today. Few organizations create their own newsrooms. I know you mentioned that when you were at PwC, you had an entire studio set up. Now, those are assets that you create so that you don't have to go out. When you create those assets, imagine if you've got a 10 to 15 member team, they're all becoming digital specialists because one or the other is rolling through that studio every other day. And so if you were just great at doing A, today you have B as a skill set because of the investment the organization has put in. So I just think that the will has to be there. And going back to the point, it's not only the organization, but it's the leader who leads the function saying, do I need this for today to create a better tomorrow and create the skill set for that, for the people in the team.
True.
And I would just add that, traditionally one of the ways that comms or corporate affairs departments have handled this challenge is, if the investment isn't available for enough permanent staff, they'll outsource to an agency, right? And you can see why that's an appealing model. But even there, I think a lot of the time, spending on agencies is becoming, in many cases, it's becoming more ad hoc. It isn't necessarily thought through on a long-term basis in terms of, okay, what are the skills we need from an agency across multiple areas that will help our company succeed. And we all know, I mean, I talk to a lot of agencies and they will say that budgets have not increased for them.
Yeah.
Comms budgets haven't increased for 10, 20 years. So it's not as if this particular challenge is being addressed by bringing in external, by improving the quality or the level of external counsel either.
Yeah. What would you suggest as the questions that PR and comms professionals should be asking themselves at the end of every year? Whether they have added value to themselves and the organization. What would you suggest one should be asking?
I love the question because it's a question that is it requires deep self-reflection. It's also a question that every professional should ask themselves at the end of every year. Actually. I'll break that into two parts. Service before self. So let's look at for the paymaster first, the organization. What are the requirements of the business? What are the goals of the business? And how is communications or the corporate affairs function feeding into those business goals? Do we have the right investments in place? Do we have the right people? And once you're able to build a plan, what does the picture of success look like? And how is it negotiable, right, at the end of the year? Like, we will launch 3 products, but perhaps the legislation may not change. The project that we need to do for sustainability may need another 6 months. But so we build a picture of success, which is, I wouldn't say that we're moving the goalpost, but we're just being practical. So I think that's the first thing that we do at the beginning of the year. And at the end of the year, we see how far we have come or what is the ground we need to cover for the next. And I think that's just an annual business planning exercise in which communications also has a part and a role to play as a function and as part of an operating or a business unit. As a person, as a professional, I think I read a lot, and anyone who does would understand that you wouldn't want to be at the same place in 12 months.
Absolutely.
Other than if it's a great seashore or a beach. But jokes aside, have I learned anything in terms of skills? Have I up-leveled my skills? Were there areas which were identified which I wanted to sort of pull my socks up? Were there things that I wanted to do in terms of exposure and experience? And in terms of knowledge, one is technical and one is knowledge more broad-based. What have I learned about my function? And how many people actually take time to read about the function or watch a podcast such as this to understand what are people saying? How many events have I attending and plugging in, say, PRovoke events? Because you sit back for 2 days and you understand what people on the stage are saying. And then more about the world. We all hear about AI. Someone saying AI is going to change the world. But then someone says that you still need dishwashers, right? AI is not going to be a dishwasher. So where is that conversation going? Would I have my job in 5 years? And I think how would they do it is you understand, you embrace the trends, you understand the business and repeat. That's it. I think that for me is what I have seen over the last 2+ decades of ensuring that I have been prevalent and a little ahead of my curve.
Your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Carson has covered a lot of it really well, and I think it requires a really a level of honesty that is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
For all of us, and it is hard, whatever line of work you're in. I think you kind of have to be honest about the impact that you're making. And I think for too long, this industry has perhaps revolved around imperfect expectations. So what's the volume of media clippings we've accomplished? And it's easy to be successful on those terms.
Yeah.
But I think fundamentally it comes back to what is the impact my business or my organization is making.
Yeah.
Right? Has that improved? Has it improved in line with the expectations of my key stakeholders? And am I able to prove that in a manner that makes sense to everyone across the organization,
Yeah.
rather than through some esoteric index that people don't necessarily always understand. So it's not easy at all. But unless we start thinking about it in those kinds of terms, I think progress will continue to be slower than it should be. If you look at the market as a whole, this is such a mission critical function. And yet it's still often viewed as something that can be switched on and off. It's still viewed as something that is not always a central strategic pillar in how a business operates. It's still extremely small when you compare it to the revenues of a business. And I think a lot of that does come down to we have allowed ourselves to settle to an extent for that. And so yes, annual is important, but actually every day we have to make sure we don't settle for that.